our sisters. Together we will stand. There is power in our union.
Welcome. This is the Long Island Fed News with John Durso, Roger Clayman, and Ryan Stanton, a monthly podcast of the Long Island Federation of Labor, AFL-CIO. I am your host, Roger Clayman, because John Durso is not able to be with us today. But we have a special guest, Nikki Kateman from Local 338, RWDSU, same union as John Durso. This is what makes the labor movement strong, when our affiliates pitch in and help us get our program done. Local 338 has been doing this for years. In fact, Fred Wren, who's on the staff, is the head of our Health and Safety Committee, just recently chaired a Workers' Memorial Day program. Nikki has been a lobbyist for her local union and has been one of the lead lobbyists on cannabis, which is our topic today. We're going to talk about cannabis, which is interesting. We all seem to laugh when we talk about cannabis. I like to listen to, when I first got a car that was an adult enough car where it had Sirius radio in it, the first thing I did was get the Grateful Dead station, And so on the station twice a week is Big Steve Parrish, who is one of the roadies, who does a program where he talks about everything, the culture of the band, the concerts that they have, but also he loves to talk about marijuana and cannabis and the scientific background of cannabis. And he said, it goes the full range from people who are very knowledgeable about to the guys who think that cannabis, where's the card, dude? That's what Steve thinks. So at any rate, this is an issue that really has major importance for our movement. And legislation was passed thanks to a lot of the hard work that Nikki did just this year. And Ryan, why don't you start by bringing us up to date on what was that legislation that was passed this year?
I'd like to start by having whatever it was you had this morning. You got us off to a great start, Rush. Thanks for turning it over. So you mentioned the MRTA, the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, and it sets up a framework for us to have a cannabis industry in New York State. It's expected to be a $4 billion industry, and there's a lot of rules and regulations when you have a $4 billion industry. And so right now we just set up the framework and the rules. We're not quite there on regulations yet. I'm sure that'll be part of the discussion later. But laying out the framework, it decriminalizes cannabis entirely. It builds on the precedent-setting Compassionate Care Act in New York State, which legalized cannabis specifically for medical purposes. And this takes it a step further and makes adult-use cannabis legal for recreational purposes. There's a lot to dive into. There's a lot to break down. But that's ultimately what it does. It makes recreational use legal, and that was the intent and purpose of the legislation.
Yeah, Nikki, I know legislation is a very long journey, and there are a lot of twists and turns in the path to actually passing a bill on a complicated subject like this. But let me ask you, before getting into some of those things, how did Local 338 get involved with cannabis? What was your attraction to working in this industry?
So first, thank you so much for having me, Roger and Ryan and John in absentia. So Local 338 came to the cannabis industry probably about 8 or so years ago, maybe even longer before that. We attended a political and legislative conference with the UFCW, which is our international union. And one of the speakers was a organizer in the cannabis industry in California and spoke about how the cannabis industry is a new frontier in every sense of that word, but specifically talking about workers in the industry, because it is an industry that has potential for being rife for exploitation since it is federally illegal still. It's still a Schedule I narcotic. And in a lot of ways, at the time, the cannabis industry was essentially the wild, wild west. So that was one way. It was kind of opened our eyes to potential opportunities for workers in the industry, but also recognizing that because it was such a new industry, there are a lot of problems that really hadn't been thought through, particularly for workers. Local 338 also came to it in a very personal way in terms of the medical cannabis space. And when one of our longtime staffers, Steve Pesnick, who I think many people in the labor movement probably remember Steve very well. He had a big heart, cared very deeply about the labor movement, cared very deeply about the members of Local 338, was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. And we saw the impact it had. And quite honestly, one of the things he was recommended by his doctor actually was medical cannabis. But at the time, it was not legal in New York State. And he did not want to put himself or his family at risk. So for us, it became a kind of moral issue, and we joined the partnership to get the Compassionate Care Act passed, and we met a lot of incredible people working on that, parents of children who had seizure disorders, veterans suffering from PTSD, people with cancer and chronic illnesses. So it became sort of a moral issue for us in terms of getting it passed to make life a little bit better for people in New York, but also recognizing that this was a brand new industry, and we had an opportunity that doesn't come very often to ensure that jobs created in an industry from the ground up are quality jobs, union jobs that pay a living wage and provide benefits and ensure that there's a career path for those who are entering that industry.
Yeah, and we all remember Steve Pesnick fondly. You know, Steve taught us a lot of things as a rep, most notably the Pesnick kit, which we all still keep in our car. You have to have,
Guilty.
You've got to be ready to go to work. You got to be ready to have a rally. So you got to have your scissors, your tape, your staple gun. And there were a lot of more things that went into the Pesnick kit, but that's how we'll always remember Steve. He was a wonderful guy. And, you know, I'm thinking about how the UFCW dove into this whole issue back in 2013 in organizing Wellness Connection in Maine, which was a medical marijuana company. People walked off the job because of the use of pesticides, and the company retaliated against them. And of course, there were unfair labor practices filed, and the company ultimately settled the case. And by that settlement, the National Labor Relations Board acknowledged that workers in this industry are covered under the Act. So was that a question that you had to deal with, is where could we really expect workers to be covered in this industry?
I think that was a thing we thought about, but I think it came sort of kind of afterwards, which is these workers need protections. As you said, there's potential for use of pesticides, which most states have and do regulate what can be used in the product since they are being consumed. But also recognizing we heard horror stories of things happening in the West, people being paid in product, all sorts of horrific cases of sexual exploitation of female workers. And we wanted to make sure that didn't happen here. And I think, you know, having the NLRB on your side is really important. But I think that was something that we realized we could figure out through the state and ensuring that there were labor peace agreements as part of the statutory requirement for licensees and applicants.
Yes. And, you know, Ryan, there were controversies in passing this legislation. Certain communities felt that they didn't want to have marijuana being sold in their community. How does the law address those kinds of questions?
Yeah, so ultimately, in legalizing adult use cannabis, it creates an opportunity for communities to have a say. But ultimately, if they choose to opt out, right? So let's rewind for a second. Effective March 31st of 2021, cannabis is legal in New York State. So if you're walking down the street today and you're smoking marijuana, you're not breaking the law. Now, by the end of 2021, the communities, specifically local municipalities, towns, villages, not including counties, but towns and villages, have the ability to opt out of the sale of cannabis. So even if they opt out, you still have the ability to walk down the street and consume marijuana. And Nikki touched on licenses, and I'm sure we'll have a deeper discussion on how the framework's been laid out. But one of the licenses that was created is a license for delivery services. There's nothing a community can do, opt in, opt out, with regard to delivery services. And so there's a strong argument to be made that ultimately cannabis is here. It's not going anywhere. It's now the law of the land, and communities need to have a real conversation about how it's going to take shape at home. And that's sort of one of the controversies. There's a lot of controversy, or historically was a lot of controversy, and I think a lot of it has been discussed and debated and fell by the wayside. Nikki, you participated in a lot of those. Some of them were around criminal justice, and ultimately the communities that have really been victim of the drug laws in this country. And so part of the legalization process is to address those sins and address the failures of public policy that we've had in this country.
Yeah, and so let's take a step back and look at the initial medical uses of marijuana. It's been established that marijuana can be an effective treatment for nausea associated with chemotherapy, for seizures associated with epilepsy. It's been postulated that any number of issues can be made better by the use of marijuana. And it really depends on who you're talking to and depends on what books you read. But one thing I've discovered that this is a very broad topic, and it's worth a lot of study because, there are a whole range of issues that can be affected by the use. Multiple sclerosis, pain, seizures, epilepsy, glaucoma even. These are all been ideas that we feel medical marijuana can be very helpful in addressing them. But you got into this at the time when it really wasn't being considered that there was going to be a recreational or public use of marijuana. It was really medical at the time. So how was the industry being structured then to provide the product?
So New York has one of probably the more restrictive medical cannabis programs in the country. There are 10 companies that are licensed to grow, process, and sell cannabis. It's a vertically integrated market currently in the medical cannabis program. And those 10 companies are entitled to 4 dispensaries each. So there are about 40 dispensaries open and operating throughout the state. There is a little bit of a process in order to get a certification to be a patient in the industry and to be a doctor in the industry, prescribing doctor as well. So there are very limited forms of how you can also consume medical cannabis. The original Compassionate Care Act explicitly prohibited smoking medical cannabis. That has been lifted with the passage of the MRTA. And I think what's really interesting about the medical cannabis industry in New York, talking to the companies and frankly our members who are working in the industry, who are the ones who are tasked with cultivating and processing and manufacturing the cannabis, but then also working one-on-one with certified patients and caregivers, because there can be certified caregivers. So if you're tasked with caring for somebody who's too ill to go on site to a dispensary, you can get certified to pick up that person's medical cannabis to make it a little bit easier and more accessible for patients. But one of the things that's really, really very interesting about the medical program is I think people have preconceived notions about who cannabis users are. And quite honestly, a large population of the consumer base in the medical program are individuals who are over 55, who are using this to treat serious and chronic conditions. And, I've been to dispensaries that we represent and seen patients coming in and out, and they just look like the makeup of New York. They are really everybody in the state and can really speak to how their lives have been improved. There is science to back medical cannabis and the usage. And quite honestly, when you talk to many doctors in this space who are supportive of not just medical use of cannabis, but also adult use cannabis, they recognize that it is a viable alternative to opioids. And there is a concerted effort to try and use medical cannabis to decrease opioid dependency because it is, in a lot of ways, less destructive and addictive. And that's been a conscious conversation, is how do we improve the medical program, recognizing for some of the pain management, this is a viable alternative, and we need to make sure it's more accessible to those who need it and are, have doctors who want them to access it. And the MRTA really took steps to expand the medical program with the goal of making it not just more accessible to patients, but more affordable as well.
Yeah. So fast forward now to this year, and we pass legislation that moves beyond just the medical use, and we're into a much broader use, so that the market and the industry are they're divided between those who are growing it, or so to speak. I think cultivation is the word that's used. There's a processing of it, and then there's the sale, the retail end of it. Describe how your members are involved in each one of those sectors.
Sure. Our members are currently participating as employees in this industry from the entire life of a cannabis product. So from the growing of cannabis, from the processing of cannabis, the drying of it, the picking of it, moving into the actual production of turning the plant into products, to the distribution of it, to the, everybody working in the retail dispensary, for currently in the medical program, pharmacists, but also those who are working with the patients and consumers. So there are members across this entire supply chain working in the industry. And there will be similar jobs in the adult use program. Obviously, medical products are much different than adult use products. They're, have different purposes. But we expect, because there are Local 338 members doing these jobs currently, that this will grow and expand into the adult use market as well. And a note about the difference between the industries, and apologies, Roger, if I'm jumping ahead here, but there was a lot of the focus of creating an adult use market in New York State was centered on criminal justice reform, social justice, economic justice, and recognizing that there needs to be a much more diverse industry. And that's why the licensing structure in New York is set up the way it is, to increase opportunities to enter the industry as entrepreneurs, as a component of restorative justice. So those who have been most impacted by drug policies in this country and the state have an opportunity to become small business owners. So the licensing structure has been set up with a goal in mind. And quite honestly, the statute also includes 50%, a standard that 50% of licenses must go to social and economic equity applicants, to ensure that there's diversity in the industry, which we support wholeheartedly. And we want to make sure that the workforce also matches that diversity in every one of those license categories that are available. And
just for our listeners, those license categories, Roger touched on a few of them, but we'll run through them quickly, are cultivators, as he said, processors, but then we also have wholesalers, retailers, and delivery services. So when you hear Nikki and Roger talking about the different ways in which the industry is broken down, those are the different licenses that folks will have the opportunity to apply for.
Yeah, Ryan, you and I have worked on getting funding for the Workforce Development Institute for many of the important training programs that we have. And, tell us a little bit about our lobbying to support the Workforce Development Institute and how they were involved in training programs and what was funded to help them make this industry grow and be successful.
Well, Nikki touched on the fact that not only does there need to be social and criminal justice component to the legislation, but she used the word economic justice. And we know that, one of the best ways to achieve economic justice is a good, strong union movement, and something the union movement always focuses on is training. And so the Workforce Development Institute, initially founded out of a partnership with the state AFL-CIO, but for our listeners, they work with union or non-union employers. Their goal, their focus is ultimately to train the workforce. they successfully lobbied for funding to expand that focus, that scope, and we'll be doing some training with our good friends over at Local 338. Nikki, you might want to elaborate a little further on that and your partnership with them.
We, full disclosure, love WDI, and we've partnered with them as well as Cornell's ILR school, and we worked together with the state AFL-CIO to secure some funding to do at least a startup on workforce development training in the cannabis industry. I have some other tricks up my sleeve that I can't disclose just yet. I have lots of those, actually.
We're going to have to have you back on.
I'm sure. Obviously this is, we're talking about a brand new industry, right? There are people who are working in the industry currently, who are in the medical cannabis industry, but I think we also need to take a moment and recognize that there are workers in the underground economy who are working in a cannabis market space that's not regulated yet. And there's going to be a concerted effort to bring those workers into the light. That's part of the conversations that lawmakers and policymakers and advocates have long had on this subject. But recognizing that there needs to be training, to make sure that the industry is standardized and legitimized, but also that we're meeting workers where they are, recognizing that there are going to be people who have no experience in the cannabis industry and want to learn about it, and those who have some background in it and also want to get their skills refined. But to kind of what Ryan touched on is training is a gateway into this industry, right? And I hate that I just used the word gateway. Bad use of word terminology there.
But at least you used it where it's appropriate.
That's true. And I'm being factful about that one. It's an opportunity for people to move into the industry and develop into a career ladder. You might start working in a cultivation center. You might want to become a manager or an owner someday. And this is a pathway to do that, right? Is giving people skills, making sure that they are trained, and that they have an opportunity to then move into a good union job.
Thank you. This is the Long Island Fed News with John Durso, Roger Clayman, Ryan Stanton, and our special guest, Nikki Kateman from Local 338, RWDSU UFCW. We'll be right back.
Congress has the chance to pass the most comprehensive labor law reform in decades, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act. The PRO Act will end years of anti-union policies, would empower workers to exercise the freedom to organize and bargain, repeal right-to-work laws, ensure that workers can reach a first contract quickly after a union is recognized. We need Congress to act now. Take action. Tell your members of Congress to support the PRO Act.
Finally, a super PAC dedicated to giving working people a seat at the table, UConnPAC.org. UConnPAC is a federally registered super PAC that gets behind causes and candidates that support expanding job opportunities through apprenticeships for all Americans, pay equity, livable wages, the right to organize, and repealing 14B, making right to work illegal in the United States. With clean money raised from regular working people, UConnPAC is changing the reputation of super PACs as a political organization that can serve the greater good. Learn more and donate today at UConnPAC.org. That's UConnPAC.org.
Here's 10 things the PRO Act will do for workers. 1. Anti-union meetings can no longer be required. 90% of employers force their employees to attend anti-union meetings. This will be illegal under the PRO Act. 2. It creates a mediation process. Half of all new unions fail because employers can refuse to negotiate. But the PRO Act ensures a first contract is reached. 3. It effectively ends right to work. 27 states have right-to-work laws, which are really right-to-work for less laws. The PRO Act overrides these laws nationally. 4. It gives us more labor rights protections. 54% of workers say they are threatened when organizing, and shamefully 1 in 5 are fired. The PRO Act tightens worker protections. 5. It gives workers more power by removing secondary strike prohibitions, disallowing permanent replacement of workers on strike, and banning proactive lockouts. 6. It requires transparency from employers. Workers' rights must be posted and anti-union consultant contracts must be disclosed. 7. The PRO Act prevents misclassification of workers. Too often employers cheat by labeling their workers as independent contractors. The PRO Act holds employers accountable. 8. It enables meaningful penalties for violations of workers' rights. Employers often face little to no repercussions, but the PRO Act ensures justice for workers. 9. It prohibits the permanent replacement of workers on strike. No more undercutting of skilled workers, as employees have done for decades. 10. It allows for more worker solidarity. All prohibitions on solidarity actions for workers across industries and workplaces will be removed. Together, we can pass the PRO Act and transform workers' rights in the United States. Check out passtheproact.org to join the fight.
It's power in a union.
Welcome back. This is the Long Island Fed News with John Durso, Roger Clayman, and Ryan Stanton. Nikki Kateman is sitting in for John. This is a monthly podcast of the Long Island Federation of Labor, AFL-CIO. I'm Roger Clayman, and I'm the sit-in host today. So we're talking about cannabis, and, Nikki had me do a presentation to the Long Island Association, and I learned a lot about cannabis in preparing for that. And I remember telling them that, in preparation, I did my own independent investigation of the retail setup when I was in San Francisco seeing my grandson, and we went to one of the cannabis stores there, and I was amazed at how well organized these stores are. They've got people who take your license, your driver's license, when you come in. They make certain that you're of the proper age, which wasn't hard to identify with me, might be with some other people. They, take you around. Somebody there takes you to all the different products, explains what all of them are for. And, one thing I learned was that there are many, many different kinds of products derived from the cannabis sativa plant, and that there are many different effects that people are looking for. Some of the THC, which is more the classic high, the CBD, which is more kind of the therapeutic treatments that people get from the use of the extracts from the plant. So it's a science, and it's a retail industry, and there's an awful lot of skilled people involved in this, and this is why the training is so important, that people understand what it is and really know their industry inside and out, know their customers, can treat the topic seriously and explain what the product does, and try to help people get something that they want when they come in the store. I mean, again, I'm sure there are people who come in and just think it's about getting high. And, it's a lot about that. But, there are many other aspects to it that are just so important. And we'll learn more as we go about those medical impacts.
And Roger, to your point, I think what's really important to remember is I think there's a misconception about the retail market is that it's like a head shop from, you'd be listening to Grateful Dead on a vinyl and then head out and get a cannabis product. But it's a much different environment. And quite honestly, to the point you raised is there are so many products in this industry, right? Of course, you can get something to smoke, but one of the emerging fields in the cannabis industry are, probably things people aren't thinking about. There are manufacturers who make bath products. So there's like bath bombs and lotions and topical creams that are similar to, like a Bengay kind of product. There's, cannabis products for pets that are CBD products. There is such a huge marketplace, and it's an innovative marketplace, and it does not look the way it did, probably even, 30 years ago, or even, the California market space has also changed and expanded and adapted as well. And so I think that's something to really keep in mind. And to your point, there is such a science. You have to know what that bath bomb does, what's in that bath bomb, or if you're talking to somebody about taking an edible, you need to know, how many milligrams it is, or how long it takes to take into effect, so that somebody's not accidentally taking too much. It's really a scientific industry with a lot of knowledge, and we really should not discredit the people who work in this industry.
What was so impressive to me was their knowledge. It was so broad about all the products, and they were very helpful. And And, when you go in, they hand you a basket. So you have to carry this basket around. And I think that helps keep their eye on you. You have the basket. But I mean, you can't reach and grab. Of course, it's all behind glass, and anything you want, you ask for, and you get an explanation, and they're more than willing to be helpful. And that's an important thing.
So I'm going to jump in here quick, just because, Nikki, you mentioned pet products, and something I completely forgot about, but, and probably something nobody's really ever thought about if they haven't been exposed to it. But my brother and sister-in-law, they have a puggle who has suffered from seizures for a really long time and was given some form of traditional medication. Obviously, I'm no veterinarian, so I don't know what he was given initially, but, it was doing nothing for him, and they were coming home, and the dog was suffering. And ultimately, there are a number of states in this country that have legalized this. And, so there's been a lot of developments in the industry and resulted in CBD products. And, that puggle here now 3 years later is got a real solid quality of life, still a member of the family, and we're happy to have him. So, that's just a personal story I completely forgot about, but it's because of the development of this industry that, our buddy Frank is still with us.
If we're talking about retail sales, we're also talking about taxation, and we're talking about the economic impacts and the jobs aspect. Ryan, what are some of the issues that came up in the course of the legislation about the economic value of the sales of this products?
Yeah, so at the opening of our discussion today, I mentioned this is a $4 billion industry, or projected to be a $4 billion industry here in New York. That's not chump change. That's a lot of money. There's also projections for about $75 million in revenue for local governments. None of this takes into account the multiplier effect of, somebody working in the cannabis space. We already talked about some of the training, right? You have to employ people to administer the training. And then the multiplier effect, oftentimes we know that means, in the traditional sense, when we talk about, say, a construction site, when somebody says the multiplier effect, they're talking about, well, that person on the construction site goes, buys lunch in the community, pizza, etc. So if we're going to have retail dispensaries and other facilities, cultivation, processing, wholesale facilities throughout the state, you're going to have people working there, spending money in their communities. And it also sort of is a natural sequitur to, or a natural segue to the zoning discussion, and where are we going to locate these facilities? And so that's something that is going to affect the economic impact. You ask about the economic impact. Well, it depends on what communities choose to opt in or choose not to opt out. Nikki, I know you did a lot of work on that. Tell us a little bit about it.
I have a lot of opinions on opt-out, so buckle up. Opt-out rate, I think, exists to give municipalities choice, which is fair and reasonable. It exists in other states. But I think some of the things I've heard focused on the opt-out conversation are really grounded in, I think, fears and misconceptions. So I think, as the baseline, one of the things I hear, and if it's okay, I'm going to go through a couple of them, and then I'll touch on zoning a little bit. So some of the things you hear are often, right, the impact on children, right? There's the statutory language that actually prevents and sets where dispensaries can be located. So obviously they can't be close to schools. They can't be located close to houses of worship. Makes sense, common sense. We agree with that. You have to be 21 or over to actually purchase cannabis. Obviously, wholeheartedly agree with that. And Roger, you touched on it a little bit, right? So the dispensary, oftentimes there's, 2 checkpoints before you can even get into the dispensary where they're scanning IDs, they're running IDs. They want to make sure that these businesses are going to want to make sure that the people who are entering the business are the ones who are allowed to be, because their licenses depend on it. You don't want to risk that. I think the other component is people who are working in these dispensaries. We talked about that they have to be knowledgeable. The other part of why you make sure they're well trained, but they also have a good union job, is somebody's going to make sure that that the business they work for is in compliance. They're not going to risk themselves or their job by doing something silly like allowing somebody to come in who's not supposed to be in the dispensary. Things I've also heard is it, impacts property taxes, which it doesn't, because what's happened in other states is a dispensary locates in a community, it increases foot traffic. It's good for the pizza place, as Ryan said. It's good for, the coffee shop, businesses open, and that's been proven in other states, quite honestly. But the other concern I've heard is around crime. Knowing how medical cannabis dispensaries are set up in New York, but also having been to dispensaries in other states, these are highly secure facilities. They have security guards, they have security cameras. There's a whole provision of regulations that often are state implemented that these businesses have to comply with to make sure that their business is safe. This is a cash industry, so they want to also make sure their business itself is safe. Our concern, aside from the opt-out, which removes, the opportunity for jobs, which on Long Island could be about 7,000 jobs directly in the industry, and that doesn't touch on all the ancillary businesses, the construction jobs, all the things that pop up around it. But that's also where, besides the opt-out stuff, our other concern is around zoning. Because zoning has a real impact on these facilities, right? We've heard talk about pushing them off away from downtowns and into industrial parks, right? And we have a very serious concern about the impact on workers, because when you put them in a space that's not well trafficked, might be off the beaten path from a law enforcement officer's beat, naturally, I think you're inviting crime in a situation like this. We want to make sure that we're shining a light on these dispensaries, that they are, not hidden or a figment of our imaginations, right? They should be part of the community because they're businesses, they're legitimate businesses, whether you agree with it or not. But also we're trying to set up a system that protects workers, but protects consumers also, right? We don't want people to feel uncomfortable going to purchase a product they're legally allowed to buy because people are going to figure out a way to do it, whether it's in your community or someplace else or delivery, or quite honestly, they can continue to purchase in the underground economy also.
Well, let's boil this issue of money down to its essence. There's a 13% tax on the sale of the products. 9% goes to the state, 4% goes to the local community. That's money, right? That's money. And then how is that used? And what happens if you opt out? Do you lose the money?
Yeah, so I'll jump in here. I know Nikki's well equipped to answer this, but I got to feel useful on this episode. So, if you choose to opt out as a community, you miss out on that revenue. You're no longer able to collect and participate in that revenue formula. And again, we touched on it earlier. It doesn't change the fact that everyone in your community can and still has the ability to utilize cannabis. It doesn't change the fact that somebody that's licensed for delivery services can and will be delivering into your community. So all you're doing is giving your money to somebody else, and you're missing out on the ability to invest in your community. And then there's a breakdown of the revenue that you're able to collect. A lot of that is to reinvest in, as we talked about, in communities that have been victims of the backwards laws in this country with regard to criminal justice. We were having a conversation during the break, and I think, Nikki, you told me you are 4 times more likely as a Latino person in Nassau County to be arrested for low-level offenses for marijuana possession prior to the legalization. I know it's 15 times more likely in New York City if you're an African American, and I know it's 5 times more likely if you're a Hispanic in New York City to be arrested than you are if you're a white person. And that doesn't account for the fact, that does account for the fact that user rates are comparable between white users of cannabis versus a person of color, right? So the same percentage, the same amount of people representative of that population are using marijuana, and yet 4, 5, and 15 times more likely to fall victim to the criminal justice system. So, but Roger, your question was on economic impact and revenue sharing. And ultimately, if you opt out, you don't get that. And that's something that's going to be important for public budgets, local governments, public safety, education, and all of those things.
So let's talk about that revenue and the investments that are going to be made particularly in minority communities. we are trying to make up for some problems that have existed in criminalization of marijuana over the years. I was honored to be a part of the Suffolk County Police Reform Task Force. All of the police departments around the nation, around New York, were required to put forward a reform plan. And we worked very hard on the Suffolk County reform plan. We learned a lot of things. That over the past 2 years, the Suffolk County Police Department pulled over black drivers 4 times more than white drivers, and Hispanic drivers twice as often as white drivers. And after stopping drivers, police searched black drivers 3 times more frequently than whites, and Hispanics 1.7 times more. And as you said, contraband was found less frequently when searching black drivers. So the fact is that there are a lot of stops that are aimed at black minority drivers. Searches take place. Marijuana is found. People go to jail. People spend time in jail. Careers and lives are ruined and set back by years. It affects the earning power of people in those communities. It affects people's ability to get good jobs and have home ownership. And fortunately, we were able to make some significant changes, which would stop the warrantless searches of cars. So, there's many aspects to the police reform, but getting at this problem and the results of marijuana arrests was very significant. So, Nikki, talk to us a little bit about what was discussed as the legislation was being passed about how we could make up to those communities kind of the years and the lives that were taken away because of marijuana arrests for even small amounts of possession.
Absolutely. I think we'll start with the baseline, which is that if the key criminal justice reforms were, a process for sealing expungement, if you have a cannabis conviction. So if you're currently incarcerated for a low-level cannabis conviction, your judgment's going to be vacated. If you first served time already, there's going to be a process to make sure your records are sealed and expunged. So that, something that you can do now legally is no longer hindrance on your record. Or, if you have now you'll have no conviction history if that's something that's already the only blemish on your record. And that's critical because having conviction histories not just only impacts your ability of employment, but it also impacts your ability to get good housing, student loans, a whole host of other issues. There were also other important pieces in the MRTA that address some things like the use of cannabis in child welfare cases, in other circumstances that negatively impact people for using cannabis. Over the years of working in this space, hearing horror stories of people having their children taken away from them because they've used cannabis, right? It seems kind of silly now, but it's, to your point, it's ruined the lives of parents and children. The other component of this, as I addressed earlier, is ensuring that 50% of licenses go to social and economic equity applicants. And there's a very detailed list of who that includes. And that not just includes communities of color, but includes disabled service veterans. It includes disadvantaged farmers. So it's a really comprehensive capture of people who might not have otherwise been able to get licenses. To that point, there's a provision to ensure that these applicants have the ability to access low-interest loans. It's very expensive to open a cannabis business. And there's a process to make sure that there's support there as individuals who are entering the marketplace. Other pieces are, there's a dedicated revenue stream for a community reinvestment fund with the goal of doing grants to a number of different projects, including legal clinics and providing legal counseling and services. There's, community groups that may not have an interest in the cannabis space, but can get grants to support communities that have been hit hardest by the war on drugs. But then also looking at the fact that For us, we saw when we're talking about social and economic justice, we wanted to make sure that jobs were included in that conversation because there are going to be between 30 and 60,000 jobs. That's one of the estimates in the industry. And making sure that if you don't get a license or you're just not interested in getting a license, that you have also the opportunity to thrive in the market as a worker.
Yeah, earlier in the program, we talked about Fred Wren, who's from your union, who it chairs our Workers' Memorial Day Committee as well as our Health and Safety Committee. And we held the Workers' Memorial Day observance last week. We talked about many of the people who've passed away in our workplaces from COVID. And then you had a very troubling incident affecting people in your union just last week. Can you tell us about this?
Sure. It's really hard to talk about because it's very personal to us. So it was unfortunately national news. This is not one thing you want to be national news as a union or a workplace. But there was a shooting at a Stop and Shop in West Hempstead, which injured 2 Stop and Shop managers and unfortunately killed a Local 338 member, Ray Wishrup, longtime Local 338 member. Hearing all the stories over the last couple weeks, it's really hard because the workplace feels like they lost somebody. He was called kind. We set up a GoFundMe to support his family. He leaves behind 7 children, a grandchild, to support it and his family, make it hopefully a little bit easier, because I don't know if anything makes it easier when you lose somebody and you lose somebody in such a violent way. But, the stories that came in on some of the GoFundMe and some of the other funds that were set up by the community in support of Ray's family all had the same thing was, when I was a new employee at Stop and Shop, he made sure to look out for me. He was always so kind, always took a minute to talk to us, and leaves a huge void in that Stop and Shop store. And I would like to thank, obviously, all the folks at the store, our Local 338 members who have really banded together to support each other at this time, but also really the community of West Hempstead has been incredible. They did a car parade in memory of Ray in support of the 2 injured Stop and Shop managers, and quite frankly, in support of the essential workers who've been key to supporting that community throughout the pandemic. So really appreciate everybody who's reached out, who's donated to the GoFundMe, who shared a memory of Ray. Because it's a tragedy, and it's not something you are ever prepared for as a union.
Nikki, just a question on that. Your local union has provided some services for anyone affected. You want to just make sure any of our listeners, if in the event that they're one of those people, that they know about it?
Absolutely. So Local 338 has a member assistance program. Our director, Jen Leipak, is essentially available all the time. She's really dove in to make sure she is there in case somebody needs some counseling or just needs somebody to talk to. So that's a program that is available in-house at Local 338 to our members. Obviously, Lexa has been an incredible partner in this too. They've been all hands on deck to make sure that if for whatever reason they can't get through to us, they are also providing some counseling and support for anyone who might need it, who is at the store, who is in the Stop and Shop family, because we recognize when you've worked for a company for 30 years like Ray did, chances are you've crossed paths with him over your career. And it's hard to process, and we want to make sure that through our member assistance program and through Lexa, people know that they can reach out, and they should reach out if they need someone to talk to.
And we'll finish with a moment of silence for Ray and his family. Thank you for being with us. This is the Long Island Fed News with John Durso, Roger Clayman, and Ryan Stanton, and our special guest, Nikki Kateman from Local 338, RWDSU. Thank you for being with us.